Hello, my name is Geoffrey Collins. I'm the flute player with the Australia Ensemble based here at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. I started way back as a member of the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, and for the last 22 years I've been principal flute of the Adelaide Symphony Orchestra. So I have some experience very much of the question of preparing for, presenting and assessing orchestral auditions, and that's what I thought would be nice to talk a little bit about today. So today will be in two parts. First of all, some general comments about my experiences and preparation and tips for people who might be interested to explore this. And then later on, I'm just going to quickly look at four very basic standard orchestral excerpts with a few comments on how, from a practical point of view, a panel will assess your results when you present material to them. I think having sat both sides of the orchestral divide, it's important to understand the process. In the old days in Australia, the major symphony orchestras were all part of the ABC, and as such they had a fairly standardised procedure of how they ran auditions for prospective members for their orchestras. But in recent decades, of course, the orchestras have been divested from the ABC. They are now separate companies, and so each orchestra now has a slightly different process, although there are some commonalities in the procedure. First of all, of course, it's an attempt to create a process which is scrupulously fair and open for all comers, whether they are known or not to the panellists. It's a small world. Everyone knows everyone else in music. It seems, and so to make sure that there's, that it's a very clean process, almost always the first round or two rounds of an audition will be anonymous as much as possible. If it's a live audition, that means there will be a curtain or some acoustic baffled furniture between you and the panellists who are listening to you. So that's a kind of a weird thing to get your head around. I'd suggest that if you are can't handle that idea, that you practice with that. Try and set up a curtain or some hanging towels or anything and invite some friends around to sit around at your place round the other side. So you get that rather disconcerting experience of coming into a room and playing into nothing, because it can really throw you if you're not at all comfortable with that. So that's one thing to just consider, that you most likely will encounter that physical difficulty about doing an audition. About the panel itself. Typically a panel for an orchestral audition will of course include some other flute players from the orchestra, some other woodwind players, probably some string players, a person who is there as a representative of the union to ensure fair process, and representatives of the management. So it can be a panel of up to 10, 12 people. And what's important to note about that is that the majority of them are not flute players. They are there to see how you would fit in with what they think about where the flute fits in the orchestra, but they may not particularly even like the flute. That's hard for a flute player to imagine, that you're playing to people who are not necessarily fans of the flute. And so therefore they're not at all interested in what kind of flute you play, who you started with particularly, except in sort of general experience sense, what finger you use for F sharp. All those kind of minutiae are of no interest to most of the panellists. Of course, the flute players are very interested in all of that, and they will have opinions about all of that. So you have to convince a lot of non-flute players about your credentials as a musician. And what they are looking for is basic musicianship and skills that are across all members of the orchestra. Very precise rhythms, very exact preparation of the material and understanding where these pieces of music have come from, having listened to many, many recordings of the pieces so that you understand exactly all the ins and outs and subtleties that are contained within, and excellent intonation to be compatible with other instruments. So it's very, very basic what they're expecting They don't necessarily want you to be a superstar who is revolutionising the way these pieces are playing. They want a kind of a standardised approach to demonstrate that that's what you can do. Of course, conductors then go and they change things, and you have to demonstrate later in the process that you're able to adapt and change. But don't try and present material in a kind of revolutionary new way. Go for a very, very standardised approach to the material. Okay, now we're going to move on. We're going to look at it more from a experiential point of view. What's it like for you? When you apply for a position in the symphony orchestra, you will receive a considerably large bunch of excerpts or material that you have to prepare, in addition to which you probably will have to prepare a standard concerto from typically Mozart, and maybe another piece that the panel might choose. So it's quite a lot of preparation involved. The list of excerpts varies a lot from orchestra to orchestra, but typically you should expect at least in the order of 20 excerpts to prepare, to test out, depending on which position it is that is available within the orchestra, principal flute, second flute, principal piccolo, and so on. They will have different amounts of material and they will look at these things in different ways. Nonetheless, there are, I guess, probably 30, 40 standard excerpts that recur in many, many auditions. And before you start this journey of trying to succeed in the area of orchestral auditions, you really should try and get hold of all of that material. And there are many volumes of orchestral excerpts, and by asking professional players, you'll be able to find out which are those, the top 20 or 30 excerpts that you just need to be on top of before you've even applied for a job. That way you will save an inordinate amount of time because you'll already be half prepared with the excerpts. There will always be a few curveball excerpts which they put in deliberately just to show something fresh and different and new. But if you're on top of those standard top hits in the orchestral excerpt space, you will be in a much better position to approach this task, because otherwise it can seem like an overwhelming amount of material when you first receive it. They do this for several reasons. First of all, they have to cover a variety of stylistic skills. So typically you will receive at least 2 or 3 excerpts from Baroque and classical music to discover whether you have an affinity with that style and then can adapt your playing to play that kind of music and the notation and the exactitude of those composers. Then there will be a bunch of music from the Romantic era, wide-ranging from different composers from different countries. There will be quite a lot of 20th century music in different styles as well. So in order to have representative samples of that, then it adds up to usually about 20 excerpts. Can be more, can be a little bit less. And it's during the course of the day of an orchestral audition, quite often there are 2 or 3 rounds, so it's not just a question of having a lot of material, different material to listen to. It's also about stamina. You have to demonstrate stamina. You have to front up and play 2 or 3 times and keep your standard for the whole time. And that's particularly it's not so bad for the flute, but for some other instruments like brass instruments, for instance, that's sort of quite indicative for them, because playing in the orchestra can be quite a grueling process. The orchestra works 24 to 30 hours a week. That's a lot of playing and preparation. When you add all that together, you need to demonstrate that you have the physical ability to be able to play well day after day after day, and so that needs to be tested in the audition space. As I mentioned before, orchestral auditions have traditionally been done face-to-face with some sort of anonymous setup. That's changing, of course, as technology is changing, and I think you need to be adapted to that. More and more, there are requirements to be able to provide video and audio material for auditions. So I think another skill that you need to work on, particularly for the modern musician going forward, is home recording And this is, of course, a very useful tool for you for assessing yourself anyway. But even with a modern smartphone and so on, it's amazing the quality of sound that's possible from your living room. And we've had some overseas applicants for jobs that have presented very respectable auditions via just very simple setups at home. And so that's something you should also consider investigating as part of your skill set in presenting as a professional audition, is being able to send material in as requested for a panel which may be sitting remotely, particularly in this COVID year. So these procedures are always evolving and changing, so don't get fixed on one way of doing it. There will be a variety of requirements as technology increases, and particularly the ability to be able to present video material from home. I'm going to move on now and take you through, fairly briefly, 4 very standardised excerpts that I've just managed to rustle up. And they could occur quite easily in any of the auditions that I mentioned. Please try and seek the excerpts online. A lot of this material is available either in excerpt books or pretty easily online these days. And it would be great if you could follow along so that I can talk more specifically about what's contained in the material. The very first excerpt is one of the classical ones that I mentioned. There will always be some classical material involved in a orchestral audition. So, this is the slow movement of Beethoven Symphony No.5. We all know the first movement of Beethoven Symphony No.5. It's been done to death, but you may be a little less familiar with the second movement. The first question you ask when you say, oh, okay, Beethoven 5, second movement, why has it been chosen? That is the question you ask about each excerpt as you go through the booklet. What's in it? What are the skill sets required in this? What are the difficulties? It actually doesn't seem all that hard. The notes, in a way, seem quite simple, but it's all about the execution. And this particular excerpt, it's quite a difficult kind of tonality, actually, sort of A flat major, F minor, that sort of thing. The top E flat can be a bit sharp, the top D flat can be a bit flat. It's hard to get a good perfect interval. So I'm trying to get my head around A flat major because this is really important looking through this excerpt. He writes Dolce at the very beginning. This is measure 100 and 132 we're starting from in the slow movement of Beethoven Symphony No.5. And you have a series of slurs, and the trouble with the flute is in the orchestra, it's kind of can be a bit of a poor relation of some of the other woodwind instruments in terms of maintaining the line. Oboe and clarinet have this great thing with the reed vibrating, and they have more air at their disposal. We lose half of our air creating the sound. And so flute players tend to have a fairly weak line compared to oboe and clarinet, and I spent a lot of time in the orchestra trying to match them. In fact, a lot of playing in the orchestra is about sounding like someone else, not just a flute player, and trying to avoid sound too much like a flute player, like a solo flute player, like you would do if you're playing a sonata or some other solo piece. It's about blending and being part of the team. Okay, so we have these slurs. But we don't want to have them chopped. We want to have them to have a sort of slight sense of floating from one slur to the next. I hope you'll notice that I'm actually keeping my embouchure in place in the silence and not dropping off. Instead, I'm trying to create a taper on the long quavers so that gives a slight sense of resonance and carries the sound forward at the same time as respecting the break in the slurs. next feature we notice there is a hairpin up and down, crescendo, diminuendo. But think of context. What is that? It's still within dolce and it's still really within piano. So don't overcook it. Keep it delicate and restrained. That goes on for a while, and then we get to the next interesting thing that I think you'll notice and encounter when you're doing these classical type excerpt, and particularly Beethoven, is this very strange marking in bar 142, which is called a kyle, K-Y-L-E. We also call them carrots in the vernacular because we didn't quite know what kyle means. And it's a particular kind of articulation that Beethoven uses. And no one really knows what it means because he's not around for us to ask him what it means. And there's been a lot of conjecture and there's questions about how much it applies when you see it written. For me, it means extremely well articulated. It's not the same as a sforzando or an accent, it's just clearly articulated. But it still depends on context. Here it's within a diminuendo, so it's quite delicate. And then it changes into some regular articulated notes and a crescendo up to a large tutti. A word about rests in orchestral excerpts, because this is one where sometimes some very good players can fall over by just not paying attention enough to the written material. And this refers back to what I was talking about with regard to the panellists being not flute players. What they're going to be trying to trip you up on is if you do not count your rests correctly in material where there's just a few beats rest. At other times, when there's a big group of rests, like 5 bars or 10 bars that are included in the excerpt, don't bother counting those. But rests that are of a short duration, only a beat or two, or a bar and a half or something which are rest, count them rigorously because the panellists will be counting along with you once you've established a rhythmic feel. And if you don't accurately count the rest, you think, oh, it doesn't matter, it's only rests, I'll just come in when I feel like in the next bit of the excerpt, you'll get marked down for that instantly. What should you do? You should listen to 2 or 3 versions of this excerpt, as with all of these. This is just a general comment, and find an average tempo for that. There is no such thing as the right tempo, but there is a standard tempo. That's what you should choose. Don't choose one if you get a recording somewhere and you think, oh, I love that, but it's so much faster than all the others. Don't do that. Sure, when you're in the orchestra, you can do whatever you like. But in this process, you want to come up with the dead standard. It might be a little bit square and you might feel a little bit musically repressed by it, but that's what you need to choose in order to present and to convince people that you know how this piece goes and what the standardised interpretation of this piece might sound like. Nothing radical, nothing wacky. Figure D, about measure 148, 147, fortissimo. Here you're trying to emulate trumpets and timpani in an orchestral tutti. So your sound needs to change from the dolce sound. Fortissimo. And so on. So you're trying to sound like something else again. When you're playing some solos, you sound like the flute, and then you can use your sound. A lot of the rest of the time, you're part of a team, and the teams constantly change. So you're constantly listening to develop your sound according to what else is going on. Then we're going to skip forward to 166, where we have a whole bunch of kyles, piano and articulated. And this is a very difficult passage to demonstrate your skill of articulation. Because you can, if you're not careful, the articulation could be too dominant for the piano dolce approach, and the calculation of the 32nd note, the demi-semiquaver, is extremely important, and the rest. Bop, 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 bum. Subdivide that very, very carefully. Make sure there's exactly the right amount of daylight in there for the hemi-demi-semiquaver rest. So, there's just one other feature I just want to point out in this excerpt, and that's at letter E, which is about 176. We have something that happens quite a lot in classical music and in Baroque music, which is the sudden occurrence of a hemiola. In other words, we're playing in a triple time, 3/8 time, and here we have, in the third bar, we have da-da-da-dee-doo-doo-doo-doo, groups of two. Make sure you show that you understand that concept of the hemiola. And that continues on in the orchestra, even though you've got rests. It's debatable, there's 4 bars rest there. It's almost too long to bother counting out. You probably could leave that out. Here we have the same dotted rhythm as before, but this time it's without the rests. So make sure you demonstrate the difference between the material. And then at the very end, you have return to the dolce again after a loud finish. So try and conclude in the dolce way that you started, despite all the things that have happened in the meantime, which might throw you off. You have to switch gear backwards and say, oh yes, I still appreciate that this was actually sweet and dolce. So there are these different voices and components which need to be very carefully assembled, put together, and within a very consistent tempo, because it's classical. The tempo doesn't change all that much. A little bit, because we're humans. The second excerpt we're going to look at today is the introduction to the final movement of Brahms Symphony No. 1. This is in almost every flute audition, so this is on that list that I mentioned of excerpts you need to be on top of before you even think about applying for a job. This excerpt is in 2 parts. There's a very famous flute solo at the end, which is all about projection and filling the hall with a lot of sound. And we'll talk about that when we get to it. But the beginning is a kind of rather complicated tutti passage, which is at letter A, bar 22, in the introduction to Brahms Symphony No. 1. And why is this here? This is here to check on your reading of the notation in great detail, even though it's not a solo, because you're playing with a whole bunch of other people, and is it going to work? There's some intonation things here for you to think about. Is the D flat going to be in tune? That's always a difficult note. And are the high notes under control and not sharp? And have you observed the rhythm and the counting of the rests? We were talking about that before. There's a lot of in-between rests here which must be exactly counted to demonstrate to the panel that you understand the rhythm of what else is going on. So it's slightly syncopated. So it's quite a long line as well. So there's the breathing aspect to it, but observing all of that. And not crescendoing too soon. He writes crescendo twice, which makes it kind of incites you to get loud very soon. But it doesn't get loud till the end. So often in the second measure of that, we actually come back in order to give us a second go at getting louder and to create more dynamic room. Look at the rhythm in the third bar. One, two, three, four. So very precise in the way that you perceive those rhythms and project them. And somehow you have to give the illusion to non-flute players that it's actually the whole orchestra playing and that you're a part of it, even though you're playing just this tiny little excerpt by yourself. And that continues on. The second part of the excerpt is a very, very famous solo after letter B. And here you need to understand the context. Normally I would pull out my flute a little bit here for practical reasons. I'd just flatten my flute a little bit because I'm going to try and play quite loudly for a second, and therefore it just helps me be a bit freer in my sound, be a bit more relaxed and open if I don't feel like I'm going to have to temper the pitch by not going sharp. So I pull the flute out for this excerpt so that I can really try and go for it a bit. The important thing here is that it's marked forte, sempre, so always loud, and passionato, passionate. But it's only forte, it's not fortissimo, so that's an interesting kind of causes you to ponder. He doesn't mean necessarily flat out, it's more about the character and the mood. But the important thing about this excerpt is to understand that you are imitating the French horn, which comes 8 bars earlier, plays the same thing. So you're supposed to sound like some sort of extension or version of the French horn, noble and grand. Unfortunately, flute players tend to see something like this and they don't think of it in that sense, and they tend to overcook the vibrato, and it sounds like a sort of very sort of shrieky, unpleasant version of the horn solo. So try and as much as you can stay noble in this sound. One thing that's difficult about this particular solo is that normally the second flute bar, when you're playing it in the orchestra, the second flute player actually plays the second bar with you and covers the crotchet rest gap. So it makes a continuous sound, which is very clever on Brahms's part. He gives the opportunity for the first flute player to breathe at that point. So the second flute player is kind of part of your team in this solo. Unfortunately, in an audition, you don't have a second flute player. So somehow you have to give this impression of continuity, even though you don't have that extra player. So trying to stay quite open in the sound, not too much hysterical vibrato, broad and grand. Very much about trying to have your head up, look up and imagine you're playing in a very large auditorium and filling the room with sound without pushing too hard and not being tight in the throat and not overcooking the vibrato. The third one is a slightly different excerpt in that it's not from an orchestral piece as such. It's from a concerto, the cello concerto of Dvořák. Czech wind writing is fantastic for all of the wind instruments, but Dvořák writes magnificent flute parts in all his symphonies, and in this cello concerto, it's an extremely exposed and prominent flute part. So not all of these excerpts that might land on your desk are necessarily from symphonies and other solo orchestral works. They could be from accompanimental material. Another example of that, of where the flute part is extremely significant, is the first piano concerto of Tchaikovsky. It's another one on the list. So the cello concerto throughout has a lot of beautiful flute solos. It's very enjoyable. So the purpose of this is to show your singing quality in the sound up high, and also a certain amount of breath control. So that's what you'll be looking for. We're starting in the first movement, before figure 4. It's about 10 bars before figure 4 in the first movement. I don't have bar numbers for this movement. The first one is just a little rhythmic test to see how well you subdivide and how well you can articulate in the low register. Bop, 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 bop. So duplet, triplet, quadruplet. That's got to be very clear and exact, with a certain sense of propulsion over onto the downbeat. And then we have a very, very beautiful melody for the flute to play, but it's challenging because it's kind of continuous and we need to work out our breathing to make the distance here. So conserve air when you're playing up high. Don't blow it all in the first bar after you take a breath. Conserve the air so that you can spend it later in the phrase and go for longer. Once again, one of the great skills for a flute player is to play long phrases that can match oboe and clarinet. And quite often that's where flute players fall down. You can hear them gasping for breath every 2 bars or something like that. And, you know, that really can mess up the sound of the whole wind section if you have a flute player who can't play long phrases. So that's not just about capacity, it's about efficiency and how you use the air. So first of all, just this first little rhythmic thing in the first bar. See if I can get that. The second excerpt is from the further on, figure 10, 6 bars after figure 10. The same kind of thing. Here we have some articulations within an expressive phrase which you need to convey. First of all is understanding how to do a sforzando within an expressive phrase. It's not the same as in an energetic piece. It does have an element of expression in it, so and it's still within piano. And then there are these little grace notes, which should have a really plaintive catch in the throat sort of feel. Oh, oh. So those kinds of elements are to be demonstrated in this one. Once again, good breath control. There's a fair bit of freedom in this one. Usually the conductor will give you the floor there and take charge and shape this phrase as you want. So that's something you need to acknowledge when you're playing the audition, but show that in a subtle way. Don't go crazy and suddenly double the speed of things. Move forward a little bit here and there if you want to show that you recognise that this is a genuine solo moment, that it's your turn to shine, but still demonstrate good rhythm at all times. The final excerpt we're going to look at today is two excerpts from a very famous 20th century piece of music, the Symphony No.5 by Dmitri Shostakovich. And the first two little excerpts are from the first movement, and then there's something from the second movement. So we're starting from before figure 40 in the first movement with a very famous flute solo, beautiful solo to play, very enjoyable, and then a little bit from the kind of quasi-scherzo second movement. It's important when you're looking at the music of Shostakovich to understand context. He lived very much within an authoritarian regime, and he had to be very careful with what he did with his music. He got into trouble at various times for being too bourgeois, too experimental. He had to fit within various rigid guidelines in what was acceptable in terms of writing music. He's one of the great composers of the 20th century, and the fact that he managed to turn out this music within these restrictions makes it even more remarkable, I think. This comes from Symphony No.5, which on the front page has a sub sort of writing which says, "An artist's reply to just criticism." This was because he'd gotten into trouble with one of his previous pieces, the Symphony No.4, which is, it's leading somewhere really quite remarkable, but it didn't please the authorities. We're talking about the times of Joseph Stalin here. And he was hauled before various committees and so on to be criticised for his adventurous approach in that piece. So this piece, in a sense, comes across initially as being much more conservative and rah-rah-rah and isn't the regime fantastic celebratory kind of thing. And certainly there's probably elements of truth in that he's doing that. But inside it, the more you know it, there's more secret code of him keeping the authorities happy, but at the same time having deeper messages of music that he wants to convey. So it's extremely important to understand that, particularly the second one, which I'll talk about in a minute. This first passage comes towards, or about 2/3 of the way through the first movement, before figure 40, and it's a solo, certainly, but guess what? It's another dialogue with the French horn. So it gives you that sort of shape of what you need to sound like, and broadness. And it has a very motoric accompaniment from the strings, which goes dum, bum, 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 bum. So you don't have much, the freedom you have to exercise here is somewhat limited, okay? But it's a very beautiful shape. And so it's another one where you really want to lift your head up and play to the hall. So it's marked piano, but it's within an orchestral context. So piano could mean a whole lot of things. If it's solo, of course, you allow the sound to develop. So you notice I did quite a big shape right up to that high note, following the contours of it. And then I maintained a kind of more of a forte sound right at figure 40 as I dropped down the register there, and made a big shape. I'm looking to try and make a shape which is like 20 bars long here, the whole of this excerpt in one big shape. That's not easy on the flute. Once again, as I said before, the air can be fragile and, you know, you can hear dropouts. So I'm trying to give this sense of unlimited space and, if you like, some giant Russian vista of space. That's the imagery that I have. Now, the next one comes a little bit later. It's marked moderato, and this is very different imagery. This is Siberia. This is cold. And the thing about this is, at figure 45, the F natural is, I pass the baton to the piccolo, who plays the F natural in unison with me. So I have to end up with some sort of blended sound that's going to kind of work with the piccolo at figure 45, the third beat. But here I'm not going to use much vibrato. I might be tempted to think, you know, oh, good, this is a nice tune. I'll put lots of my solo flute vibrato on this. But don't. Try and look for a kind of transparent sound, not a filled-in dark low register sound, but rather a cold, frigid sound. Hopefully will blend with the piccolo. So try and get your friend or yourself to play a low F on the piccolo and see if you can make, what sort of sound will I make? But you'll notice that it's a breath control excerpt. It's quite hard in context because you've played a whole lot of loud music and that other big solo, and it's hard to just compose yourself inwardly to go to another place and not be wobbly or nervous at the end of this movement, because you've got adrenaline flying around to just go inside yourself for great calmness and clarity for that excerpt. So the final one we're going to look at is in the second movement. At first glance, when you look at the music, it looks quite happy, quite humorous even. Could be quite jolly. But the thing to understand about Shostakovich is when he is apparently humorous, it's generally sarcastic. It's saying something else. It's a hidden message. One of the conductors I worked with, I think, summed it up quite well, this solo, about the fragility of this solo that I think comes across, is that it's not happy, even though it's sort of got happy music kind of characteristics. he explained it to me as being a poverty-stricken flower seller on the pavement as Joseph Stalin walks by, saying, "Please, Mr. Stalin, will you buy some flowers from me to help me feed my children?" It's that kind of double meaning which I think you need to convey in this kind of music. It's not what it seems. Notice at the end I did a big crescendo because I know, and you need to demonstrate, that the orchestra comes crashing in at the end of that solo, and you're leading the way back into da-yum, bom, 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 another ironically funny but sarcastic moment in the piece. So those are just a sample of a few excerpts that you might appear. A lot of them, so some of them seem quite short, some of them seem not that difficult in terms of notes, but there's a lot contained within them. And it's the ability of candidates to look past just very basic notes, to understand what it is, the technical skills that are required, but also the context. Where does the music come from? What's its meaning? What's the style of this particular kind of piece? Listen to lots and lots of recordings. It's very clear to a panel who's done their homework and who hasn't. Usually you can tell within 5 minutes. The panel will forgive wrong notes. They'll forgive all kinds of things, but they won't forgive poor preparation or lack of taking it seriously as an event. The candidates that are serious and have done this kind of homework, they will have prepared all the basic excerpts and they will have done a lot of background on each of the pieces. That comes through very, very clearly. And those are the people that will progress in an audition. So, thank you for listening today. I hope that's been of some assistance, and we hope to see you at the University of New South Wales soon.